Thank you, Maharaj. Today, we are glad to have such eminent speakers as Swami Sarvapriyananda, Minister in Charge, Vedanta Society of New York, Swami Atma Rupananda, Resident Minister, Vedanta Society of Greater Houston, USA, Sri S. Sridharan, Trustee, Senior Most Mentor Teacher, Consultant Therapist, Krishnamacharya, Yoga Mandiram, Chennai. We have Swami Vireshananda, Editor, Prabuddha Bharata, Belur Math. And we have our own Swami Atma Priyananda, Pro-Chancellor, Ramakrishna Mission, Vivekananda University, Belur Math. Today, we are dealing with a very interesting topic. The philosophical thoughts of India are deeply influenced by Vedanta. And Vedanta deals with the meaning of life and life after death. It is the science of the creation and the dissolution. In course of time, the philosophy of Vedanta suffered a degradation. It faced many ideological challenges and abuses. Many felt that Vedanta has nothing to do with the worldly life. It only deals with metaphysical plane, and it stands only on baseless imagination. But many realized the spiritual, especially the spiritual masters, newly interpreted the Vedanta philosophy with a humanitarian touch. The new interpretation helped the Vedantic philosophy to regain its dignity. The interpretation, they have a scientific outlook. The new tradition deals with the day-to-day of life of mankind. Swami Vivekananda gave a new face to the traditional Vedanta. The philosophy of Vivekananda has got worldwide acceptance. It has an outstanding status. Vivekananda had firm ideas gleaned from the theories of Vedanta philosophy. He had developed them from his own experience. Vivekananda's comments on the Vedas are the primary source of Vedanta philosophy. So we would love to hear from our eminent speakers. Our first speaker is Swami Sarvapriyananda. He is the minister and spiritual leader of the Vedanta Society of New York. Swamiji joined the Ramakrishna Math and Mission in 1994 and received sannyasa in 2004 before being posted to the VSSC's Hollywood Temple. Swami served as an Acharya, teacher of the Monastic Probationers Training Center at Belur Math. He has served the Ramakrishna Math and Mission in various capacities, including being the vice principal of the Deoghar Vidyapith Higher Secondary School, principal of the Sikshashana Shikhan Mandir Teacher Education, that is where we provide them with B.Ed and B.Ed degree at Belur Math, and the first registrar of the Vivekananda University at Belur Math. Today, Maharaj is going to speak on Mundaka Upanishad's twin bird imagery and Swami Vivekananda's real and the apparent man. Maharaj.
Thank you very much.
You're also telling the timings.
Yes, I think I have 1 hour. So what I'll do is I'll divide my time. I'll speak for about 40 minutes and then take questions from our panelists and the attendees, if that's all right. So thank you very much for having me in this second webinar. And thank you for the choice of subjects. I think it's a very well chosen subject with regard to consciousness studies. So in the Mundaka Upanishad, we find this famous simile of the two birds, where the apparent self and the real self are compared to two birds sitting on the same tree, the tree being the tree representing the body. So the Upanishad begins with very poetic imagery. Swami Vivekananda loved it and he has referred to it more than once. Dva suparna sayuja sakhaya samanam vriksham parishasvajate tayoranyah pippalam swadvatti anashnananyo abhichakashiti. Here, it's mentioned that there are two birds of glorious plumage, very beautiful birds, who are friends, who are associated with each other, and they are on the same tree. One of them hops around tasting different kinds of fruits, sweet and bitter, while the other one just looks on, is uninvolved, just looks on. One is sitting on high and looking on. The other one is moving from branch to branch and pecking at different fruits. Swami Vivekananda expands on this simile. He says that once in a while, this lower bird pecks at a particularly bitter fruit and gets a shock, and then looks up at this beautiful higher bird, which is serene and calm and is established in its majesty, and is attracted towards that bird, and it moves towards that higher bird, but then quickly gets distracted by various kinds of fruits, pecks another one, and that's sweet, and it forgets its upward journey and starts experiencing these fruits, tasting these fruits again, until it gets another bitter shock and tasting a bitter fruit. And in this way, progresses upwards till it comes close to the higher bird. And suddenly when it comes close to the higher bird, it merges, as it were, it vanishes into the brilliance of this higher bird and realizes there was no lower bird at all. All the time there was only this higher bird. So this is the simile which you find in the Mundaka Upanishad. And I think this is particularly striking in terms of the problem of consciousness studies, which we are facing today, especially the philosophical aspects of consciousness studies. The second mantra, just after this, it speaks of what is the meaning. It gives the references of these two birds. Samane vrikshe purusho nimagno anishaya shochati muhyamana jushtam yada pasyatyanyamisham asya mahimanamiti vita shoka. So the tree, which represents the human body, and by the way, I would strongly recommend reading the commentary on this by Adi Shankaracharya, who gives a very dramatic depiction of life, embodied life in samsara. So the various sorrows and experiences one undergoes in samsara. And here itself, the embodied consciousness, the lower bird, which represents the empirical person, the person we experience ourselves to be, is shown as immersed in sorrow and helplessness, anishaya, and groaning and moaning under this helplessness. But through a process of spiritual contemplation, jushtam, when it finally realizes its own nature as that higher bird, as that infinite consciousness which is untouched by the travails of samsara, and it sees the entirety of samsara as its own glory, it goes beyond all sorrow. So there's a lot to unpack here. I will not dwell too much on this because we'll leave it to Swami Vivekananda to unpack it for us, but I'll just quote a little bit from Shankaracharya's commentary, which is so evocative. What happens when we realize the real nature of consciousness, who or what we truly are? And Shankaracharya here says, Isham sarvasya jagato ayam ahamasmi atma sarvasya. So when I realize this glorious nature of my own glorious nature as this existence awareness, which is not subject to the travails of samsara, birth and death, disease and hunger and thirst and so on. And not only that, I find that this consciousness is the same in all beings. Sama sarva bhutastha. In all beings, it's the same consciousness. It is one without a second. Na itara. Not what I thought myself to be. I thought myself to be this person of flesh and blood, this body mind. He says, avidya janita upadi parichinna maya atma. This self, which is a product of illusion, caused by the limitations generated by ignorance. So even the limitations are the upadhis, the adjuncts are also not real in themselves. And then what happens? Vibhutim mahimanam cha jagat rupam asyeva mama parameshwarasya. This entire universe, which was a threat to me earlier, when I saw it as an other, is now my own glory, the glory of this infinite being awareness. And then what happens? Yada evam, when one realizes, when one has this and a breakthrough, this realization, tada drashta vitashoka bhavati. Then the experiencer, the subject, goes beyond sorrow, realizes itself as being beyond sorrow. Sarvasmat shoka sagarat vipramuchyate. From this entire ocean of sorrows is set free, and kritakritya bhavati, and attains the culmination, the purpose of human life. So one might as well say that consciousness studies, understood in this way, is the highest discipline that there is, and it actually has the greatest potential for overcoming sorrow, overcoming suffering. Now, where does Swami Vivekananda come into all of this? In New York, in the Vedanta Society of New York, about 125 years ago, Swami Vivekananda gave this talk, The Real and the Apparent Man. It was a Sunday talk, and there he starts off with the same question that the Mundaka Upanishad starts with. In the Mundaka Upanishad, at the very beginning, we find the student going to the teacher and asking, Kasminno bhagavo vigyate sarvamidam vigyatam bhavati iti. And Swami Vivekananda starts with this. He says that this search for unity has been the central theme of Vedanta. By knowing what, does one know everything? And then Swami Vivekananda comes to this idea of the self, of the real nature of the human personality, that we are not the body. He says the ancient Hindus, the sages of the Upanishads, they investigated this and they found within this human body a subtler body, the Sukshma Sharira. Nothing very mystical here. If we look into ourselves, we find that we have these two sides to ourselves, a public side, the physical body, and a private side to us, which we experience, which only we experience, our own thoughts, feelings, emotions, ideas, perceptions within ourselves, the first person experience which we have. And that's the subtle body, Sukshma Sharira. And they found beyond these physical body and the subtle body, beyond these Sthula Sharira and Sukshma Sharira, both of which are changing, both of which are observable, both of which in some sense are objective. Beyond this, subtler than this, inward to this, is a self, the real self, the Atman. So this was the idea. Then Swami Vivekananda introduces the great challenge from the Buddhists. So Swamiji dwells on the next movement. It's a wonderfully crafted talk, The Real and the Apparent Man. A very thesis, antithesis, and synthesis kind of movement. So the Buddhist challenge comes up. Buddha, and especially the philosophers who followed him, raised a tremendous challenge to this idea of a separate self, that there is an ultimate, unchanging reality, separate from the body and mind, which we call the Atman. This was the position of the ancient Hindus, the Naiyayikas, the Vaisheshikas, the Sankhyas, the yoga philosophers, and some of the Mimamsakas also. In fact, all of the Mimamsakas actually. And against this, the Buddhists raised tremendous opposition. A range of extraordinary philosophers, Nagarjuna, Vasubandhu, Chandrakirti, Dignaga, Dharmakirti, and so many others. They came and they asked this question. Swamiji says they asked this question, where is this separate permanent self? All that we observe, all that is evident to us is a body, a series of physical changes, is a mind, a series of mental changes. Beyond this stream of physical and mental changes, the psychophysical entity, constantly changing. Beyond this, other than this, what else is there? Where is the proof of a third entity, this tripartite concept of the human personality, which the Hindus propounded, the ancient Hindus propounded, body, mind, and soul, self. Where is this third thing called the self? So the attack was on the concept of a permanent self. Let me take this opportunity to explore a little more in detail the nature of this attack. It revolutionized Indian philosophy, basically. The central attack was on the idea of a permanent self, and also allied to this, the idea of God. Because in ancient India, especially for the Naiyayikas, Vaisheshikas, God was another kind of self, even for the Sankhyas, for the yoga philosophers. God was just another kind of self, a supreme self. So if permanent self could be attacked, you could dispense with the idea of God also. There was tremendous development over a period of 700-800 years. Development in logic, in the philosophy of language, in psychology, metaphysics, of course. A lot of works were written. I think this is one of the golden periods of the flowering of Indian philosophy. One example, let's take one classic example of the attack on Atma from the Buddhists. This is not what Swami Vivekananda does not go too much into detail, but I'll just offer one example. So Nagarjuna's commentator, Chandrakirti, who belongs to the Madhyamaka, the Shunyavada school of Buddhism. Chandrakirti, in his Madhyamaka Avatara, Prasannapada, he has this, what is called a sevenfold reasoning, a sevenfold attack on the concept of a permanent self. So what he does is he uses the metaphor of a chariot. He says, a chariot doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a chariot. That's the example. How does a chariot not exist? It seems obvious that there is a chariot. I can say, Mr. Chandrakirti, you came to this debate in a chariot. So how come there's no chariot? He says, where is the chariot? He gives this sevenfold, famous sevenfold reasoning. If you Google it, you'll find its English translations are available. Is the chariot something which is the parts of the chariot? Is the chariot to be found in the parts of the chariot? No, he says, there is no chariot to be found in the parts of the chariot. In the parts of the chariot, there are only the parts. Similarly, is there a self to be found in the body-mind? And then you go through a lot of discussion to show that the body-mind cannot be the self. And the Hindus are agreed here. Except the Charvakas, all the other Hindu schools are agreed on this, that the body or the mind is not the self. Then second alternative. So is there a chariot apart from the parts? This is what the Hindus seem to be saying, that there is an Atma apart from the body-mind. So Chandrakirti asks provocatively, is it possible that the chariot exists apart from the parts? And obviously this is a strange conception. And if you say there is no parking for the chariot, you can bring your chariot in, but leave the parts of the chariot outside. That's impossible, you can't do that. So there is no chariot apart from the parts also. Similarly, where is this Atma apart from the body, apart from the mind? And a lot of debates took place, very intricate debates. The Hindus tried to argue, mostly unsuccessfully, that you need a permanent self to explain memory. You need a permanent self to explain identity. You need a permanent self to explain karma. You need a permanent self to explain birth and rebirth, which the Buddhists also accepted. And in each of these cases, the Buddhists gave pretty good theories, substitute theories of their own, process theories, which explained memory and recognition and identity and karma and rebirth without the necessity of a permanent separate self. In fact, they would show that the permanent separate self actually does not help in explaining these things. One of the Buddhists, later Buddhist, Dharmakirti, actually says the permanent self, he compares it to an ugly goiter, like a big lump which comes out on the side of your neck, which is ugly and useless and unhealthy. Similarly, this idea of a Hindu idea of a permanent self is absolutely unnecessary. It's actually harmful. Then the third thing is there a self? Is there a chariot contained in the parts? Imagine the parts of the chariot to be like a bowl in which you keep flowers. So are the parts like a bowl and in which something called a chariot is kept? Obviously not. Similarly, the body-mind is not like a container in which something called an Atma is kept. Or the opposite, is the Atma a container? Is the chariot a container in which the parts are kept? Is the chariot like a bowl in which you keep the parts of the chariot? Again, no. Similarly, is the Atma a container in which the body-mind can be kept? Again, no. It is obviously not. At this point, the Hindu might react and say, you're just confusing matters, Mr. Chandrakirti. What I obviously mean is the Atma, the self, is a possessor of the body-mind. Just like I have a car and a house, similarly, I have a body and a mind. I'm the possessor. Again, this can be very easily attacked, and the Buddhists do so. Where is this precious possessor of the body-mind, apart from the body-mind? When you say, I possess a car, you're referring to the body-mind, which possesses a car. But where is the self, which possesses a body-mind? Not there. Another alternative, I think we are up to number 6 probably, is the chariot a collection of parts? So if you have all the parts together, is that a chariot? Again, not. I mean, if you just keep the parts, disassemble them, is that a chariot? No. Finally, one might push back and say, look, we all know what we mean by a chariot. We just assemble the parts in a certain way and a configuration comes and that's a chariot. And the answer is again that no part has the shape or configuration of a chariot. Where does this shape called a chariot reside? Where is this shape? If you say it just emerges, and that's what we call a chariot, Chandrakirti would be most happy. He said, that's exactly what I mean. The concept of a self just emerges, it's imputed, or later on is what Advaitins call an adhyasa. It is just superimposed on the body-mind, on the activities of the body-mind. So it's not even the shape or the configuration of the body-mind, which is the self. Sevenfold reasoning, smashing any possibility of a separate, independent self or Atma. Of course, the Hindu philosophers, especially the Naiyayikas and the Mimamsakas, especially Kumarila Bhatta, they pushed back. Udayanacharya, the Naiyayikas, and many of them, they pushed back. Their very subtle arguments are there. Atma Tattva Vivek of Udayanacharya. Kumarila Bhatta's, some of his texts where he refutes the stream of consciousness theory, the Vijnanavada. But anyway, so it stood. And if one is a little unbiased, one may say that the Hindu philosophers might have got a little bit of the worst of the whole exchange, which took place for nearly 900 years. Then comes, so Swami Vivekananda says at this point, the solution came from non-dualism, from Advaita Vedanta. I just add here, it's one of the assignments that I had to go through. A professor, J. Garfield, who is an expert in Tibetan Buddhism. So he said, okay, so an Advaitin monk, you write a defense against Chandrakirti's attack. So I had to do that from the Advaitic perspective, defend the concept of self or Atma against Chandrakirti's attack. And it was an interesting process. My paper got returned 3 times before he finally said, okay, now you have a solid defense of Advaita Vedanta. Anyway, Swami Vivekananda says that non-dualism gives the answer. It is not that there is a self apart from the body-mind. As the Buddhists say, the Buddhists are right. There is no third entity called the self. It's not that when there is a snake and a rope, it's not that there is a snake and underneath that there's a separate reality called the rope. No, no. It is only one reality, which is mistaken, misperceived, misunderstood as the snake. And when you really understand it, it's a rope. Similarly, there is only one reality, which in our transactional empirical sense, it's a mass of change, as the Buddhists say, absolutely right. It's matter and body and mind, a flux, a series of changes. But the Hindu is also right. There is an ultimate reality. And that is the reality of this mass of change. When you understand what is going on here, when you penetrate through the facade, the veil of name and form, we come to a transcendent reality, which is beyond change. Actually, change and unchanging do not really apply there. So an ultimate reality where, which can be called the self, in a very subtle sense, the Buddhists also arrived at this, you know, from what I gleaned from studying a little bit of classical Indian Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. I have to put it very carefully. There are schools of Tibetan Buddhism, especially Chinese Mahayana Buddhism, which come very, very close to the Advaitic position. When they talk about the Tathagata Garbha or the suchness or the ultimate Buddha nature, the language is very similar. There is one school which was suppressed in Tibetan Buddhism called the Jonang school, whose texts are extraordinarily like the Advaitic text, Advaitic conclusion, the clear light of the void and non-dual light of the void and so on. So from the non-dual perspective, there is one reality, a spiritual reality, which appears as this mass of change. And here Swamiji introduces Maya, that because of Maya, this existence awareness, unlimited existence awareness, the higher bird of the Mundaka Upanishad, appears as both the tree of samsara, the body, and the consciousness reflected in this body, the lower bird. So Swami Vivekananda says Maya is name and form. He gives wonderful examples. I mean, the talk is spread. There's so many beautiful examples there. He says, imagine the wave and the ocean. It is not that the waves are something different from the ocean. It is the same water with the names and forms and activity which you call the waves. And the names and the forms, and the beauty is that names and the forms and activities are not a separate reality because they cannot exist without the water. You take the water away from the wave, there's nothing left of the wave, neither the form nor the activity. And so the name also does not refer to anything at all if there is no water in the wave. So the water alone appears as the wave through name, form, and activity, nama, rupa, vyavahara. Another example he gives is millions of globules of water and the same one central sun shining, and you have an appearance of millions of suns. This is to show that one consciousness appears as many. In the Bhagavad Gita, avibhaktam cha bhuteshu vibhaktam iva cha sthitam. Undivided in all beings, it appears to be divided. That's another example he uses. And then he takes up is Maya a second existence? No, because name and form have no existence of their own. They still depend on Brahman, of the ultimate reality. Then he takes up the question of the problem of evil. Oh, he mentions, it's very important for Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy here. He mentions not that it does not exist. Maya, he says, not that it does not exist, seeing that it makes all this difference. So he gives us a kind of existence to Maya. Classical Advaita Vedanta, of course, agrees with this. The whole thing about sadasadhyam anirvachaniyam, that you cannot say it exists in the sense of Brahman, that an absolute existence, but you cannot say that it does not exist also. It's not absolutely non-existence, because the entirety of all of this, this universe, our activity, our existence as the lower bird, our experiences as the lower bird, even our webinars, all of this is possible only because of Maya. He gives other examples also. Page after page of a book are being turned. You don't change, but the book of life is being read. So that one existence awareness, but Maya presumably is the book which is being read. Then he gives the example of train and motion. So he traveled throughout the United States on a train. And he says, when your train is moving, the fields appear to start moving suddenly. The landscape appears to start moving suddenly. So the idea of change in Maya is superimposed on the witness consciousness. I appear to be born. I appear to be aging with the aging of the body. I appear to be elated or depressed with the ups and downs of the mind. I appear to be transmigrating with the transmigration of this of the jiva, of the subtle body. So it's like a train which is moving, but actually doesn't seem to be moving, and the landscape suddenly seems to move. The sun and the earth. It is the sun which is steady and the earth which is rotating, but it seems to be that the sun is rising and the sun is setting. So that example also he gives, where change in Maya is superimposed on the self, and the self appears to be changing. He takes up the question of the problem of evil. If all is, the ultimate reality is pure consciousness, we are Brahman, we are the higher bird, how is it that, does Brahman do bad things? Does Brahman steal and kill and murder? No. Here, Swami Vivekananda is uncompromising. He says the sin is not evil and sin are not the ultimate reality. He gives the cute example of a baby in a room, and there's a bag full of gold, and a thief comes to steal the gold. But for the baby, gold is not gold, and the robber is not a robber. Swami Vivekananda says, you see sin outside, but only when there's sin in our hearts. So he made that stunning statement, sin to call man a sinner. It's a sin to call man a sinner. When our real nature is that glorious higher bird, that infinite existence consciousness, then in what sense are we a sinner? There he gives a very beautiful comparison. He says, hell appears to the man when the mind is colored by wickedness. This very existence, this infinite existence awareness, this very existence is seen as hell, is experienced as hell. To the mind colored by goodness, this very existence consciousness is experienced as heaven. And to the enlightened person, this very existence consciousness is seen as God alone. So the same existence consciousness at a lower state of the mind in wickedness is seen as a horrible existence. Same place, same experiences, same existence consciousness appears as heaven to a good person, and to the enlightened person appears as Brahman. Is this practical? Can one actually realize it? So there's Swami Vivekananda mentions something very interesting there. He says, it is practical, it can be done. I have met such people. One of them, his touch changed my entire life. We know who he's talking about, Sri Ramakrishna. And then he says, I'll tell you about him next Sunday. So we gathered that this was actually a Sunday talk, and the next Sunday he was going to talk about Sri Ramakrishna in New York. What is the use of this? I'll mention this and then I'll stop and take questions. The use of this, he says, is that fear goes away. I had read somewhere Wittgenstein said that all religion is a search for absolute security, that we want to overcome our fears. All fear goes away when there is no other. Upanishads themselves say, Dvitiyadvai bhayam bhavati, from the existence of the other. Note the difference, not just the appearance of the other. The appearance of the other will continue. The world will continue to appear for the enlightened and the unenlightened. People will continue to appear. Our bodies will continue to appear. Karma will continue to give its results. But the experience will continue, and the enlightened person, however, knows that all of it is nothing other than my own glory. Asya mahimanamiti. Whereas the unenlightened person sees it as an other and a threatening other. So once that sense of otherness goes away, you very clearly see every person is nothing but I, myself, with a capital S. Every so-called object is an appearance in me, the consciousness. There's absolutely nothing outside awareness or consciousness. In that case, what is there to be afraid of? Fear goes away. Swami Vivekananda, in soaring language, glorious language, he says, then alone love comes. The husband loves the wife more by seeing God in the wife. The wife loves the husband more, seeing God in the husband. The friend loves the friend more by seeing God in the friend. And the so-called enemy, you can love your enemy by seeing God in the enemy. Swamiji says, you ask, what is the utility? The utility is this. If even a tiny fraction of humanity were to realize this truth, then this earth would be turned into heaven. Gods would love gods. Gods would play with gods. Gods would work with gods. And this, the whole problem of suffering would be solved. So this is the grand result. And he goes on to say, even in its land of birth, that means India, this philosophy has not been widespread, but now the time has come to to broadcast it across the world. And that's what he did. A couple of notes. One thing I just remembered, in the Buddhism class, the professor would say, Swami, keep your Advaita outside the door. Don't bring it inside the class. And these are two different things. Fine. Outside the class, I met a Tibetan monk once in the streets in Cambridge. And he was a Lama who had a Tibetan school. He belonged to the Sakyapa group. And he asked me, what are you doing here? I told him, I'm studying your philosophy. And then he said, but you're a Vedantic monk, Advaitic monk. I said, yes. And then he said, same thing, you know. I was thinking, the professor told me they're two different things. And here's the Lama who's telling me the same thing. Not only that, he said, that thing you have, the 5 verses on wisdom. I said, Manisha Panchakam of Shankaracharya. Yes, that one. I use it to introduce Tibetan Buddhism. I use it to teach it. So he is a Shunyavadi. His philosophy is based on Madhyamaka Shunyavada. And he's teaching his students using Shankaracharya's Manisha Panchakam. So that was extraordinary to meet this person. The one I want to end with on this is this absolute equality. It's possible through non-duality. I found this wonderful comment by Shankaracharya. Paramam prakrishtam niratishayam samyam samatam. And this is on the 3rd mantra of that same chapter, same section, where he says, Niranjanam paramam samyam upayati. So the stainless, transcendent oneness or equality is attained through this non-dual realization. Shankaracharya says through non-dual realization alone, the greatest equality is obtained. And then he says, he takes a dig at dualism. He says, Dvaita Vishayani Samya. He says the kind of equality you may attempt to get in the world of duality is far inferior, is always subject to defect. I was just thinking, I'll end on a political note. So, it's Ganesh Chaturthi, I'm referring to Lakshmi, who's Kamala. So Kamala Devi, I've been getting queries here. Ask the Swami, what does Kamala mean? Because she has been nominated recently, Kamala Harris, as the vice president nominee. So what does it mean? I have to say that it means the goddess who dwells on the lotus, the Lakshmi. Equality. See, the more you try to force things through, okay, we need a black woman as the presidential candidate. And now you have a nominee. Now you know what the debate is? Is she black enough? Isn't she half Indian? And she's a Tamil Brahmin. So they are not inferior, oppressed. They're not oppressed enough. They are superior. Do you know the history of Tamil Brahmins in India? So the more you try to establish equality, at a level of dualism, the more tangled one becomes. The true equality is attained from the vision of non-duality. All right, I'll leave you with that comment. I think I still have a good deal of time, right? Okay.
Yes, Maharaj, we'll continue till 10:15 with the questions. So the first question is, from Swami Sarvapriyananda Maharaj, respectful pranams, Maharaj. Many spiritual masters speak about the causal body. The gross and subtle bodies are experienced, and the scriptures and the masters guide seekers to transcend the problems of these bodies. Is the causal body experienced by the jiva? How is it transcended to realize the Atman?
From whom? From whom?
This is from Krishna Vahegoankar.
Thank you for that question. Yes, the causal body is experienced by us. What we experience in deep sleep, for example. So, I mean, whether there is an experience at all in deep sleep or not, that's the big question. But Advaita Vedanta would say when we wake up from deep sleep, we have this experience that I slept happily and there was, I did not know anything. So this experience of I slept happily, I did not know anything, it can be seen as an experience. I often say deep sleep is not the absence of experience. It's an experience of absence. That is the experience of the causal body. In the Institute of Culture, about 15 years, 20 years ago, there was a series of seminars on consciousness studies just like this, that was held physically, not virtually. There was an interesting debate between a neuroscientist and a philosopher, a Sankhyan philosopher, Professor, our very well-known Sankhyan philosopher, Larson. Swami Atmapriyanji knows him. So Professor Larson, who passed away recently, I think last year or so. He's an American philosopher. He's an expert on Sankhya. So he asked a question to the neuroscientist. He said, doctor, in the neuroscience view, is there consciousness in deep sleep? And the neuroscientist replied, no, in our operational definition of consciousness, there is no consciousness in deep sleep. And then Professor Larson said, well, from an Indian philosophy perspective, Sankhya or Vedantic perspective, there is only consciousness in deep sleep. And so this is the gulf. Consciousness does not have an object, and therefore you get an experience of blankness in deep sleep. Advaita Vedanta would modify that and say that consciousness illumines the causal body. Ignorance or ajnana is revealed in deep sleep. Vedanta Sara also says, how do we know that there is a causal body? How do we know there is ajnana? He says, vadanti aham na janami. I do not know. When we say that, we are actually experiencing the causal body. Yes. And this causal body is basically the potential state of the mind. When it is active, we call it the mind. We are either dreaming or awake. But when it is resolved into its seed state, that's what we call the causal body. Did that answer the question, or was there another part to it? Janardhan Babu? Hello?
Yes, thank you, Maharaj. So do we go to the next question?
Yes.
Yeah, we have two questions from PSV Krishna. The first question is, if self is beyond space, time, and causation, what is it that carries our karma from one birth to another? I will read out the second question also, but if you want me to read
No, read it.
Okay. The second question is, how does Buddhism explain reincarnation when it denies the existence of Atman? What then reincarnates according to Buddhism?
Very powerful questions.
Yes.
Is the questioner around? Can we see the questioner? P.S. Krishna ji?
Yes.
Krishna. It'll be interesting to see his face also, if possible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, he cannot come live, he says.
Yeah, he can. No, he can.
Oh, there he is.
Yeah, please, you go ahead.
Yes. They have very clear answers to these things. So Buddhist response would be twofold. One, the Buddhist would say that, first of all, your idea of a permanent self, how does that explain rebirth? See, what goes from life to life? If there's an unchanging self, it cannot go anywhere. If it moves and it changes and goes from place to place, then it's not unchanging. So an unchanging self cannot explain rebirth. It cannot even explain the other things like memory and recollection and all. If it's anyway involved in any kind of action, like going from life to life, being born and dying, going from one body to another, then how is it unchanging? And if it is unchanging and immobile and not going anywhere, in that case, how does your Atma explain rebirth? So number one, so it's a very classic strategy. It shows, first of all, your theory does not explain what you are asking, what you're propounding. Now I'll offer my theory. And the Buddhist offers a theory of change. So there's a subtle body, but it's full of change, of kshanika vijnana. That means a series of momentary instants of consciousness. So imagine the mind and consciousness together, like a vritti which carries its own power pack of consciousness. So a flash of consciousness which comes into being and then disappears, but leaves an impression. So the next flash of consciousness bears the impression of the earlier one. And so you have change and a certain continuity also. It is this continuous flashes of consciousness which are transferred to the next birth. They take up other bodies, if at all bodies are admitted. You see, there are different schools of Buddhism. So Vijnanavada will not even admit bodies, just flashes, subjective idealism. So flashes of consciousness going from one birth to another, or experiences of different births. So that's how they would explain rebirth. They would explain memory also in this way. Remember, there are certain fundamental differences between assumptions of among the Buddhists which differ from Hindu philosophers. For example, changelessness is a sign of not reality. So a real thing must change according to Buddhists, because their criterion of reality. How do you define reality? What's real? So the Buddhist criterion of reality is artha kriyakaritvam, practical efficacy, or some kind of effect must be generated. If something has an effect on something else, then it is real. So water, for example, if you drink it, your thirst is quenched, it feels wet, and you quench your thirst. In that case, that water is real. Why isn't the water in a mirage real? The Buddhist would say, because you go to try to drink it, it does not fulfill its purpose. It does not work like water. So a very pragmatic approach to reality. Of course, the Advaitin has an answer to that. The Advaitin would say that you go to water and drink the water, it quenches your thirst, the next moment you wake up, it was all a dream. In that case, the whole thing is falsified. So the Advaitin would take badha, abhaditattvam satyatvam, that unsublatability of an entity is a characteristic of reality. But we are going afield. Yes, so the Buddhist can explain and does explain rebirth, memory, recognition, identity by this series of flashes of consciousness, Vijnana Dhara, and says that permanent Atma is not necessary, cannot explain all these things, and cannot be proved. Did I answer?
Add something to this.
Yes.
What we heard from Ravi Tapasyanandaji Maharaj on this. See, the Buddhism says there is no permanent self, as he said, a stream of consciousness continuously moving, and at any point of time, that one particle in that stream does exist. And that contains the efficiency and character of all that has gone before. So every point in that consciousness movement transmits its entire efficiency, character, content to the next one, and then just dies. So at every moment the self is born, not the self exists as a permanent entity. At every moment the self is born and dies. And this self at this moment, which contains the entire content of the selves of the previous moments, this self passes on to the next body. So it's called Pratitya Samutpada. Pratitya Samutpada, they translate as doctrine of dependent origination. If you are exposed to mathematics and science, there's a process called Markovian process in science, which says that at any point of time, that point alone is real. The unreality that the Buddhists talk about is the unreality of one permanent self sitting there, goes from here to there. It's a stream of consciousness, as it is beautifully described by Sarvapriyananda ji, but at that particular moment, only that moment exists. And that dies, next moment is born. This is very similar to what Bhagavan Ramana Maharshi calls as a self is constantly arising with each thought. Or J. Krishnamurti, for example, he says, thinker is actually projected by thought to ensure security. There is no thinker except thought. So thinker projects, is being projected by thought at every moment, and at every thought a thinker rises and sets. And this is that moment which gets transmitted. If there is no idea of rebirth and karma, Buddhism would still remain as a descriptive psychology and not a religion at all.
Maharaj, there was another question. The first one, if self is beyond space, time and causation, what is it that carries our karma from one birth to another? A question by the same person.
Right. So that I should have answered that before going to the Buddhist thing. It's a very simple thing. It's a subtle body. So at death, the physical body, Sthula Sharira, dies, and the Sukshma Sharira, which has 17 parts according to some description, 19 parts according to another description, which contains the powers of the 5 sense organs, the 5 motor organs. It contains the 5 pranas and the antakarana, mana buddhi chitta ahankara. And this conglomerate is supposed to transmigrate. It goes into a seed form, and then it goes to other worlds, propelled by its own past karma, and propelled by a portion of its past karma, which is activated, prarabdha karma. It takes a new physical body. Atman is the same all the time, again from an Advaitic perspective. There is only one Atman or Brahman, which is all pervading and always the same. Yes.
Thank you, Maharaj. The next question is from Indu Ramachandani. In the experiences of the psychophysical system, we have all the fears and joys, etc. So in the effort of dealing with all, keeping in mind at the same time that it is Maya, can one be completely committed in karma? Should I repeat the question once more?
I heard it, but I'm not sure exactly what is being asked here.
I'm just
what she means perhaps, what she perhaps means is that, so we are experiencing fears and joys and sorrows, etc. But at the same time, we should remember all this is Maya. In that case, how much will be our commitment to what we are doing now in the world of Maya?
Yes, yes.
What he says,
Right.
karmanna vidvamso yatha kurvanti bharata, kuryat vidvams yatha asaktas chikirshulloka sangraham. Knowing all this is ultimately, when you are in it, to take it to be real. So the idea of the global and the local perspectives. Globally, you realize the whole thing is Maya and Leela, but locally, when you are in it, it is always taken to be dead.
Absolutely.
I give the example of always playing a game of cricket or soccer or football or baseball. You know the whole thing is a game. When you lose it, you don't feel depressed or unhappy. When you win it, you don't feel elated. But when you're in it, you play it with dead seriousness, knowing that it is a life and death question, you have to win the game. But outside, when you come globally, the whole thing is Maya.
Absolutely. I think that's what was asked, right? Right. One can actually act more effectively if one is enlightened.
Yeah, exactly. Swami Vivekananda says, the more you are dispassionate and detached, the more effective will be your work.
Because people ask sometimes, if you are enlightened, won't you be depressed? Won't you be bored? There's nothing more to do after this. I always say in these cases, look at the lives of the people you consider to be enlightened. Did they appear to be bored after enlightenment? Or did they become depressed and suicidal after enlightenment? No, they were actually much more joyful. They were much more effective. Yes, so that's right.
So my take is, anyway you are depressed and unhappy, why not try this?
We're going to try and enlighten.
yeah.
Where is that
Next question.
Next question.
We have the next question from Mr. Kunal Sikdar. We all are a specific type of human species called the Homo sapiens, which means the wise man. But there was a time, 70,000 years before, when at least 6 other species of human beings used to dwell in this very planet. And some of them had even bigger brains than us, like Homo Neanderthals, etc. Did they think about this kind of a philosophy, which we are talking about in their age? Does Upanishad tell anything about those ancient men?
Is there an Upanishad for Neanderthals?
Yes.
Maybe there was, I don't know. Who knows? I mean, the answer would be, the Buddha's answer would be to tackle our own problems first. Look at our own ignorance and suffering, and here is this teaching, and go beyond this. So what comes to my mind is Aldous Huxley in his perennial philosophy, in the very first chapter, when he talks about that thou art, the Advaitic insight, the unity of the divine and the human. He says, it is a mistake to think, it's a mistake to think that this is the highest idea that came after a long period of evolution of religious and spiritual thought. We often think, that in the Vedas, there is ritualistic thought, and then there is upasana, contemplations, and finally knowledge comes. He says, no, even in all of these wisdom traditions, when you go back to the earliest sources also, you find this intuition. And he says, it's my feeling, even in aboriginal times, in prehistoric times, there would have been people who would have had this intuition, this oneness of all existence, the divinity within. Maybe they didn't have our language, our philosophy, our ways of describing it. So, and even in the Vedas, one Pandit pointed out, it's not really true that Advaita comes only at the end in the Upanishads. It's there strewn all throughout. In the very first mantras of the Vedas, Ishe Tva Urjetva or Agni Mide Purohitam, in those ones also, you can give an Advaitic interpretation to those. So, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Tapasiddhanandi has
A question.
Marat Pranam. Here, Sayanacharya says every mantra can be interpreted in the context of Yajna, Adhyatma, and Adhidaiva. Adhiyajna, Adhyatma, and Adhidaiva. That is what Swamiji also rightly points out when he says that the ideas are scattered all through the Vedas, only if the observer is keen enough to see it. Thank you, Maharaj.
That's a wonderful insight. I think Professor Sitanath Goswami in the Institute of Culture, he pointed out every Vedic mantra has, as you said, a karma paksha, a devata paksha, and a jnana paksha. That is a yajna, interpretation in terms of yajna, an interpretation in terms of upasana of a devata, an interpretation in terms of knowledge, the liberating knowledge of one's own divinity within. So one may, if you want to trace an evolution of ideas, that's an interesting project. But it's also true that this thing is scattered all throughout the literature. Whether Neanderthals had it or not, I'm not very sure.
You see, the Vedantic position is that all knowledge is in Hiranyagarbha, which is the cosmic mind, and which is called Supreme Brahman, and Brahma Devanam Prathamasam Babhuva, and so on. So the idea is the Hiranyagarbha, the cosmic mind, being the repository of our knowledge, and which is timeless and eternal. Knowledge is continuously being downloaded from the Hiranyagarbha internet by human beings, by even species, birds, animals. Sometimes we see animals having such extraordinary wisdom which human beings do not have, for which when we have VIPs and VVIPs visiting, the stupid human beings take dogs to find out whether there is any mischief done by somebody else. So that means dogs also perhaps download from the Hiranyagarbha and they have their own wisdom. So why not this, the man at the ancient times 70,000 years ago?
I think so. In fact, that's an important point. If we actually go by Vedantic wisdom, the idea is the Vedas are knowledge, especially spiritual knowledge, and they are already pre-existing, and they manifest from time to time in particular minds. Professor J.N. Mohanty, who is wonderfully well-versed in both Eastern and Western philosophies, he told me something. Once he met the great philosopher Hannah Arendt, and she told him the great difference between us and you Easterners, that means Indians, is that while we believe that something comes out of nothing, you believe that something comes out of something. So all knowledge that we think about in Vedanta, from a Western perspective, you have this question of how did it evolve? And before this knowledge evolved, what was there? Was it not? So it was not there at all. But from a Vedantic perspective, as Swamiji rightly said, the question doesn't arise at all. The knowledge was already there, and it had just manifested given once proper circumstances became available, proper minds became available. So yeah, in a deeper sense, you have to think about the perspective. Even the question itself, that when they were Neanderthals, no Homo sapiens, could this knowledge have been there? It presupposes that knowledge is also evolving. It's not, from a Vedantic or Sankhyan perspective, knowledge would be manifesting rather than appearing for the first time.
We are running out of time. One question will be there. That is by Kumar Sitaraman. There is the dream and the dreamer. So let us end with the dream so that people can remain awake.
You're muted. I can't hear you.
I'm reading out the question. It's from Kumar Sitaraman. In dream, there is a dreamer away from the dream. Many times we can feel the dreamer as a separate entity. Is this entity the Turiya?
In a dream, what happens is, after waking up, when you analyze the dream, you realize that we the dreamer, I was in my bed safe and sound, and I totally forgot myself that I'm in this bed, I'm sleeping, and a whole new world appeared before me. A world where there is space and time and objects and people and interactions. And I have a body too. I have a body there, a body in the dream, and a mind there too, in that body. So in that body, in the dream, I have my own body. I have my own personality, which interacts with other people. And there's a story which goes on. And when I wake up, I realize that I, who was in that dream with that particular body, and the entire dream world, both the subject and the object. In Mandukya terms, the Taijasa and its Swapna Prapancha, the dreamer subject and its world, the dream world, both were products of the waker's mind, which had gone to sleep. So one mind in its own place, it produced a subject and an object. Now, the Mandukya says, just like that, that's an example, just like that, in this waking world also, there's only one consciousness which appears as I, the subject, and this body and mind, and my subject's world, the Vishwa and the Jagrat Prapancha, both are appearances in one underlying consciousness, which runs in and through the waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. I don't know if that
Thank you
answers
so much. We had a very, very wonderful session, and we ended with the Mandukya, and I call Sarvapriyananda the Mandukya man in the West.